The cargo hold of the C-130 Hercules was packed with enough ammunition to level a city block. Captain Sarah Storm Mitchell gripped the controls as warning alarms screamed through the cockpit at 25,000 feet above the Sahara Desert. Beside her, Major Jake Thunder Rodriguez was already calculating their odds of survival. 0%. Left engines completely dead. Right engines running at 30%. Jake shouted over the chaos of failing systems. Hydraulics are gone, fuel's dumping, and we've got about 4 minutes before we're a very expensive crater in the sand. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with surgical precision. She had logged over 3,000 flight hours, survived 3 combat deployments, but nothing had prepared her for this. The massive transport aircraft was carrying 40 tons of high-explosive ordnance to a classified forward operating base in North Africa. If they crashed with that payload, the explosion would be visible from space. Thunder, I need options. Now. Jake's fingers flew across his instruments, his mind racing through emergency procedures drilled into him over 15 years of military aviation. Storm, there are no options. We're carrying enough firepower to take out a small country. Emergency landing protocols don't cover this scenario, because no one's supposed to survive it. The aircraft shuddered violently as another system failed. Through the windscreen, the Sahara stretched endlessly in every direction, 3.6 million square miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. No roads, no rescue, no hope. But Sarah Mitchell didn't become the youngest female cargo pilot in Air Force history by accepting impossible odds. Thunder, remember flight school? The miracle of runway 09? Jake's eyes widened. She was talking about the legendary emergency landing that every military pilot studied, a cargo plane that had landed without engines, without hydraulics, without hope. It was considered impossible. It was also their only chance. Storm, that was a training simulation. This is 40 tons of live ammunition over the largest desert on the planet. Then we better make sure we don't screw this up. At 20,000 feet, the second engine died completely. The C-130 became a 130,000-pound glider, carrying enough explosives to flatten a military base. In the sudden silence, broken only by wind rushing past the fuselage, Sarah and Jake faced a decision that would determine not just their survival, but potentially the lives of thousands of people below. Storm, we need to jettison the cargo. Dump it over empty desert before we attempt landing. Sarah's jaw tightened. Negative. That ammunition is headed to Firebase Alpha. Our guys are surrounded, outnumbered 3-1. Without those supplies, they're dead. If we don't dump the cargo, we're all dead. Then we don't crash. At 15,000 feet, Sarah spotted something that made her heart skip. A thin line, cutting through the endless dunes, an abandoned World War II airstrip, used by Allied forces during the North African campaign. It was barely visible, probably hadn't seen an aircraft in 70 years, but it was their only shot. Thunder, 2 o'clock, about 8 miles, you see it? Jake squinted through the heat haze. Storm, that's not an airstrip, that's a death trap. No way to know if the surface is stable. No idea what obstacles might be there. We'd be betting our lives on a runway that's older than both of us combined. We're betting our lives either way. At 12,000 feet, the situation got worse. The cargo hold fire suppression system had activated, but something was wrong. Instead of extinguishing potential flames, it was creating a toxic gas cloud that was slowly poisoning them both. Storm, we've got maybe 10 minutes of breathable air left. After that, we're unconscious, and this bird flies itself into the ground. Sarah's vision was already starting to blur, but her hands remained steady on the controls. Then we land in 8 minutes. She began the most dangerous descent of her career. Without engines, she had to use gravity and wind currents to guide the massive aircraft toward a target the size of a football field, while carrying enough explosives to create their own mushroom cloud if anything went wrong. At 8,000 feet, Jake spotted the real problem. Storm, the runway. It's not empty. There are vehicles down there. Looks like a nomad camp, set up right in the middle of our landing zone. Through the haze, Sarah could see them, several trucks and what looked like temporary shelters. Families, children, people who had no idea that death was screaming toward them at 200 miles per hour. How many people? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. I count at least 30, maybe more. Sarah had 2 choices. Attempt to land around the obstacles and almost certainly crash into the explosive cargo, or try to warn them somehow and hope they could move in time. At 6,000 feet, she made a decision that would define her forever. Thunder, take the controls. I'm going back. What? Storm, you can't leave the cockpit. Someone needs to warn those people. And someone needs to secure the cargo so it doesn't shift during landing and turn us into a fireball. Jake grabbed her arm. That cargo hold is filled with toxic gas. You'll be unconscious in 30 seconds. Then I better work fast. Sarah unbuckled her harness and headed toward the back of the aircraft. The cargo hold was a nightmare of smoke and poison gas. 40 tons of ammunition secured only by netting and prayers. If any of those crates shifted during landing, the impact would detonate everything. Fighting unconsciousness, she worked with desperate speed to reinforce the cargo restraints. Her military training kicked in. The same procedures she had drilled thousands of times, now performed while barely able to breathe or see. At 4,000 feet, Jake's voice crackled through her headset. Storm, I can see people moving down there. Looks like they heard us coming, but they're not moving fast enough. Sarah stumbled back toward the cockpit, her vision tunneling from oxygen deprivation. How much time? 3 minutes to impact, maybe less. She collapsed into her pilot seat and took the controls back from Jake. Below them, the abandoned airstrip rushed toward them like a concrete arrow pointing at disaster. The nomad camp was still partially in their path. At 2,000 feet, Sarah did something that violated every emergency landing protocol ever written. She rolled the aircraft. A 130,000-pound cargo plane, loaded with explosives without engines, performed a barrel roll at 180 miles per hour to avoid hitting the families below. The maneuver should have been impossible. It should have torn the aircraft apart. Instead, it lined them up perfectly with the clear section of the runway. Storm, that was either the most brilliant or the most insane thing I've ever seen. Let's hope it was brilliant. At 500 feet, they could see the runway surface. Cracked concrete, scattered with 70 years of sand and debris, but intact. The nomads had moved their vehicles just enough to give them a narrow corridor of clear space. At 100 feet, Sarah pulled back on the controls with everything she had. The C-130 hit the desert runway at 150 miles per hour with no engines, no hydraulics, and no margin for error. The impact sent shockwaves through both pilots' bodies. As the landing gear absorbed forces it was never designed to handle. The aircraft bounced, hit again, bounced higher. For a terrifying moment, it felt like they might cartwheel end over end, turning 40 tons of ammunition into the world's largest accidental bomb. But Sarah kept fighting the controls, and Jake deployed every emergency system they had left. Drag chutes deployed, emergency brakes engaged, and slowly, impossibly, the massive aircraft began to slow down. They skidded for over a mile, throwing up a cloud of sand and smoke visible for 50 miles in every direction. Sparks flew from the landing gear. Chunks of runway concrete exploded around them, and the smell of burning rubber filled the cockpit. Finally, incredibly, they stopped. For 30 seconds, neither pilot moved. They were alive. The ammunition was intact. The nomad families were safe. Then Jake started laughing, the kind of hysterical laughter that comes after cheating death by milliseconds. Storm, do you realize what we just did? We landed a dead aircraft, loaded with explosives, on a 70-year-old runway, in the middle of the Sahara Desert, while avoiding a refugee camp. That's not flying, that's a miracle. Sarah was already unbuckling her harness. The miracle will be getting this ammunition to Firebase Alpha. Our job's not done yet. What do you mean our job's not done? We just survived the impossible. Thunder, those soldiers are still surrounded. They still need these supplies. We're in the middle of nowhere, with no engines and no communication. We need to figure out how to complete our mission. What happened next became the stuff of military legend. The nomad families they had avoided weren't refugees. They were Tuareg guides who knew every inch of the Sahara. When they realized what the two pilots had risked to avoid harming them, they offered something more valuable than gold, their knowledge of the desert. The tribal elder, a weathered man named Amelo, spoke broken English but perfect strategy. You soldiers need to reach your brothers, yes? We know the way, but not with Broken Bird. Over the next 6 hours, Sarah and Jake learned they had landed only 40 miles from Firebase Alpha Desert 2, but 40 miles of desert that would kill them if they tried to cross it on foot with 40 tons of cargo. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Tuareg had been watching the firebase for weeks, concerned about the fighting that had displaced their traditional routes. They knew exactly where the surrounded soldiers were, and they had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. Your ammunition, it comes in smaller boxes, yes? Amelo asked through his son, who spoke better English. We have trucks, not big enough for airplane boxes, but big enough for hand boxes. They were suggesting breaking down 40 tons of military ordnance into packages small enough to transport by truck convoy across desert terrain that would challenge a tank. "That'll take forever," Jake protested. "The firebase doesn't have forever." Sarah was studying the cargo manifest. "Actually, Thunder, look at this. Most of what we're carrying is small arms, ammunition, and medical supplies. The heavy stuff, the artillery shells and rocket systems, that's maybe 10% of the cargo." A plan began forming that was as dangerous as their landing had been. They would strip the C-130 of everything essential: ammunition, medical supplies, communications equipment. The Tuareg convoy would transport the critical supplies across the desert using routes that had been secret for 1,000 years. Sarah would stay with the aircraft to establish a communication relay point. Jake would accompany the convoy to coordinate the delivery. "Storm, this is insane. We don't know these people. We're talking about trusting classified military cargo to desert nomads." "Thunder, these people just watched us risk our lives to avoid harming their families. They're offering to risk their lives to help our soldiers. Sometimes you have to trust the people who prove they're worth trusting." The convoy departed at sunset, 8 trucks loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and Jake Rodriguez, who was beginning to understand that this mission would redefine his understanding of courage. Meanwhile, Sarah worked through the night to establish communications with Firebase Alpha, using the aircraft's emergency radio system. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Mayday, Mayday! This is Firebase Alpha. We are under heavy attack, casualties mounting. We're down to our last magazines. Estimate 6 hours before we're overrun. If anyone can hear this, we need immediate resupply or immediate evacuation. We won't last until morning." Sarah keyed her microphone. "Firebase Alpha, this is Captain Mitchell. Call sign Storm. Your resupply is en route. Estimate delivery in 4 hours. Hold your position." "Storm, this is Firebase Alpha Actual. We have you on communications, but no visual on air support. What's your status?" Sarah looked out at the desert night, where the convoy's lights had disappeared into darkness. "Firebase Alpha, we're operating under unusual circumstances, but your supplies are coming. You have my word, as an officer and a pilot." What she didn't tell them was that she had no way to know if the convoy would make it, if the Tuareg guides could be trusted, or if Jake would survive the desert crossing. 4 hours later, Sarah heard the sound that every military pilot dreams of, the voice of American soldiers receiving desperately needed supplies. "Storm, this is Firebase Alpha. Your delivery arrived right on schedule. I don't know how you did it, but you just saved 43 American lives. The convoy leader, a guy who calls himself Thunder, says you're still out there coordinating. What's your status?" Sarah smiled as dawn broke over the Sahara. "Firebase Alpha, mission accomplished. Tell Thunder that Storm is waiting for pickup." The rescue came 12 hours later, a helicopter that had followed Jake's coordinates back to the crashed C-130. But by then, the story was already spreading through military communications networks worldwide. 2 pilots had saved their aircraft, their cargo, and their mission through skill, courage, and the help of people they had chosen to trust in the middle of nowhere. The Tuareg guides refused any payment, saying that helping soldiers was payment enough. They did accept one gift, an American flag that Sarah had carried through 3 combat deployments. It was the highest honor she could offer, and they understood its significance. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Mitchell was promoted to Major and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Major Jake Rodriguez received the same promotion and decoration, but the award they treasured most was a handmade compass from Amalal, inscribed with words in 3 languages, "For those who navigate by honor." The abandoned runway where they had landed was officially designated as Emergency Landing Site Alpha, the first time in Air Force history that a World War II airstrip had been reactivated by a miraculous crash landing. Firebase Alpha held their position and completed their mission, thanks to supplies delivered by the most unusual convoy in military history. And somewhere in the Sahara Desert, where 2 pilots chose trust over fear and courage over safety, the wind still carries the sound of engines that refuse to quit, and the voices of people who prove that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places. The impossible landing became possible because 2 pilots understood that their mission wasn't just about flying an aircraft, it was about bringing hope to people who needed it most, no matter what obstacles stood in their way. In the military, they still teach the Desert Storm landing as an example of crisis decision-making under impossible circumstances. But the real lesson isn't about flying techniques or emergency procedures. It's about the moment when 2 strangers chose to trust each other with everything that mattered, and discovered that miracles happen when people refuse to give up on each other.